And welcome to Heart of America Society. I'm Dwayne Johnson. I'm glad you can be here tonight, and I'm excited to have Byron Belitsos with us this evening. I'm sure most of you know or know of Byron, but to give a bit of background, Byron is an award-winning book publisher who is also an author, editor, journalist, and educator. His many books include Your Evolving Soul, the Cosmic Spirituality of the Urantia Revelation, The Adventure of Being Human, and Healing a Broken World. He's considered a leading exponent of the Urantia Book, having spoken widely on its teachings in the United States and in Europe. Byron is going to talk a bit about his new book, Truths About Evil, Sin, and Inequity toward the 21st Century Theodicy. His specific subject today deals with the Urantia revelation and the problem of evil. And I think most of you sent some note or received some notes that I sent out on that behalf. But before we begin, I would like to welcome Barbara Newsom, whom, again, I'm sure most of you also know, and ask you, Barbara, to give us a brief meditation.
Yes. Dear Heavenly Father and Mother in one parent combined, as we gather from many parts of the United States and even the world for this special program, we pray that we may feel the presence of God with us in our learning and reflections, and help us to better understand the issues of evil and in our world, and especially how we might be of a desire to do good to others in loving service in all of our different situations and activities for a special planet, Michael's bestowal planet. And we remember the teachings of our Creator Son as Jesus of Nazareth, who also shared so much with us about these matters of moral choice on our world. In all that is good and all that is holy, so may it be. Amen.
Thank you, Barbara. And so, Brian, I'm going to let you take it away. But first, I wanted to say that when I first saw the title to your book, and then again, when you sent out your notes, my first thoughts went to the difference between how we generally define evil and sin in our society and certainly in Christianity, which I'm most familiar with, and the meanings attributed to those words by the Urantia Book. And I'm curious, one of the things I will be listening to is how those differences affect your attempts to address these typical answers to the problem of evil that you've outlined here.
Okay. Let's keep this informal and open discussion. I've got a huge bunch of things I could say, but I think we're all quite on the same page. I think everyone here is a veteran reader or is well acquainted with the text at least, and so I'm going to maybe start with a little question. You just opened up, and thank you for the intro. Yeah, leave the light on. It's actually better. How would you, as our host, define what you understand about evil and sin that's distinctive about the Urantia Book? Let me just ask you that, so we can maybe launch with that distinction.
Well, I'll be brave. Without checking my Urantia Book, my recollection is that evil is something that happens because we live in an imperfect world. It's like shit happens. Sin is a little more intentional. when we go against the will of the Father knowingly and with full recognition of what we're doing. That's my take on it.
That's roughly how
How
I
you,
understand it too. Evil more as error and ignorance, and sin, on the other hand, as doing something intentional that we know we shouldn't be doing.
yeah, so then we extend this line, I actually call it the line of moral turpitude, or it's like a chart actually that my book has, that we start with error, but even prior to that, we have this phenomenon called accidents, right? Which some of the ancients and also some of the medieval, I should say, Reformation theologians, even such as Calvin, thought there were no accidents, so that if something happens to you that causes suffering and pain, it's not random. It's not an accident at all. It's God intended some misfortune to happen to you. And so one would sort of take personally when there were accidents. Whereas a modern mind is such that we understand that accidents are accidents. But, really for much of the history of Calvinism, that, things that happened to you, until more recently in Calvinist theology, they've kind of given up on this, but everything that happens is ordained by God or permitted by God, including accidents. But for us as Urantians, we have the level we could call accident, which is purely chance. So that's I put that in the chart, so to speak. And then the beginning of what we call properly evil is actually error, and error is often mixed up with evil as well. And particularly, with youth or young or immature people, they're engaged in error, and so in a more strict, maybe Christian framework, they're evil in that they're making error and they're making mistakes. So this can cause trauma to young people, and probably has throughout history in these strict environments. But we know as Urantians, there's a very strong distinction between evil and error and evil. What I was surprised at in the UB is that evil is not as evil as I thought it was. It's a little bit striking, actually, if you study this, that evil is not what Christians might say. Standard Christian ideas. Evil and sin are kind of the same thing. They're almost synonymous, and you just find that kind of a big problem in Christian literature, that they conflate the two very often. And I think I theorize that the reason Christianity does that is because of the original sin doctrine. That because original sin was so endemic in the view of certainly the Catholic Church, that whatever happens is probably an emanate or something that was derived from your sinful nature, your inherent sinfulness. So whatever it was, they called it sin, when it really was, for a Urantian, it's actually what we would call evil, or even error, or even even accidents. And so it's a big consequence here, and I think is why this is an important teaching in the UB that needed to be highlighted, so that it just in sort of everyday life, you're not feeling so down on yourself that you're a sinner, who has made these grievous errors, venial sins and mortal sins, right? So we as we kind of come away from the more Catholic doctrine of the original sin, we begin to make these distinctions, and it really goes into maybe uh, three terms: evil, sin, and iniquity. Right. So when you get to iniquity, you're in the domain of Luciferian perpetration. So we want to be able to to teach others about iniquity in particular, because there's not enough of a sense, I think, among Christians, probably Muslims even, and Jews and others, that there is this Luciferic presence, which is a kind of evil that doesn't really arise naturally in evolution, in human evolution. It's really something that you might say is imported or off-planet product of very dark minds and darkened minds that are celestial beings that became very dark and who are powerful beings with the power of such a power that they could rain down iniquity on the planet. And that's not your everyday sin that we grew up hearing about. This is something that's not just consciously violating the divine will, but is systematically destructive of divine purposes, and even more, it's trying to overthrow divine sovereignty, and pushing it to the point that you put the demonic personality on the throne of God. Right. This is the blasphemous, attitude of iniquitous personalities, that they want to put themselves in the place of God. So when you look at the kind of the behavior of Caligastio, you see blasphemy, of course, in Lucifer and Satan, etc. And so this is in a way the deepest kind of sinning, but again, we say this is not just sinning, this is iniquitous. So I hope you're all not too depressed at this point, because we have to balance this discussion with acknowledgement that in the Urantia revelation, there's also a revelation about degrees of goodness too, right? So we not only have this set of distinctions about that I just talked about on the dark side. On the light side, we have a set of distinctions about moral goodness, in the sense that we have gradations of our evolution, right? That our evolution from childhood on, and then into the Urantia life. You might even say that each level of the mansion regime is a level of goodness, right? So you have levels of goodness in this life, and then you have levels of goodness beyond this life, all the way through the mansion world regime. And then finally you get to the point of maybe mansion world 5 or 6 or beyond that, when you fuse with your thought adjuster. So fusion is a great good, right? So we have a teaching about a very great good that we will all attain, and that's just really almost the beginning, isn't it? Because we go forever beyond that into eternity, into higher levels of attainment of goodness and righteousness and all the rest. And so we could get pretty depressed talking about the Lucifer rebellion, but we should be really lifted up by the fact that we have a glorious future ahead of us. And that brings me to a key distinction that is really, really important in theodicy, in this practice of theodicy, which it's a technical term used by sort of professional theologians, but it's a good word to have in your lexicon, because it's the study should be defined. Everybody pretty much defines it the same way. The theodicy is the discipline of trying to figure out how a good God, who's omnipotent, would permit so much suffering, sin, evil, and iniquity. How could that? How can you have such things in the same understanding? That if God were all powerful and all benevolent, why do we suffer the way we do? Why are we going through the war in Ukraine? Or why do we have so many people living in great adversity? I mean, dying in the streets, on the streets, homeless people. I mean, on and on. I mean, what sort of God allows this kind of suffering and pain? And so the work of the Theodicists of the past was tough because they didn't really understand about the Lucifer rebellion. They knew about Satan, but they didn't know much about that. So they had a real tough time sort of exonerating God, right? So it's often seen that theodicy is you're trying to actually convert people into faith in God, because when people backslide in their faith, it's almost always, very often having to do with experience of evil and the resulting pain. Because when we say evil and sin and these things, they always are perpetrations, right? So somebody's being hurt, and so the result and the outcome is pain and suffering or death. So we're actually really talking about pain, suffering, and death, and we have a hard time maintaining our faith when terrible things happen, particularly when awful things happen to good people, right? And bad things happen to good people. The name of a best-selling book. And so how do we cope with that if we're sitting in the middle of the war in Ukraine, where I just heard 100,000 soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, have died there, one estimate. So how do these people who are people of faith, how do they cope with that? How do they keep their faith in the middle of that? Well, that's what Theodicy does. And as Urantians, we can do a better job than almost anybody in lifting people up by again talking in particular about the gradations of goodness, right? That we will experience in eternity, which are in truth and in fact a way to exonerate God from this charge of allowing and apparently permitting these awful things, particularly on our planet. So what we say in reply to that is, all of this will be, justice will be served, but not right away necessarily, right? The justice is something that it unfolds over our lives, and especially in the mansion world regime, which is in a way one of the purposes of the mansion worlds, especially for a rebellion planet like this, is to dispense mercy, justice, and love to those who need it for rehabilitation. But that's not the only rationale that we can give for justifying our faith. There's many others that we can get into. Let me ask, what is our timing? How much time do we actually have? I forgot a lot. So how much time left? Everybody's muted except me.
Dwayne, you're muted.
You're muted,
Yeah.
Dwayne.
Okay, I would like for our meeting to end around, let's say 10:20. We started about 10 minutes after 6. So,
Okay.
and maybe allow a little bit of time for questioning.
Yeah. I'm looking at my time here. It's 7:30. So we're talking about another, 40 minutes or more?
Okay, yeah, well, I have essentially 6:30 now. So let's say another 50 minutes.
50?
Yeah.
Okay.
Including time for questions.
Yeah. I had a mix up. I'm actually, I'm so sorry. I'm thinking this was in 2 days from now. So I'm actually with a friend, and so I'm not going to extend really long in this and try to condense what I have to say in the next, say, half hour or 40 minutes. So but because it gets pretty dense, really. So there are 6 or 7 different ways to do theodicy. I show in my book, and by the way, the book is called Truths About Evil, Sin, and the Demonic. Not truth about it. We don't have the truth about it, but we have truths. But what I'm hoping to do in the book is to show folks that what we have in our history, beginning with, say, the Old Testament conceptions of evil, particularly in the book of Job, and is that there is an evolution of conceptions right up until the present moment in the Judeo-Christian world that is really quite impressive. But there's like these schools of thought, and I'm saying there's half a dozen schools of thought, and that what we find is that the Urantia book actually addresses all of them. Actually, not only addresses these schools of thought without naming them, but it in a way synthesizes them into a systematic conception of theodicy. And so it's actually an integrative theodicy that is novel and very helpful in the world, I think, in the world of the future, as people get to know about this, particularly given the kind of dire circumstances on the planet right now, where there's going to be, unfortunately, a lot more suffering than one can imagine, in my opinion, given conditions. That there's going to be a huge demand for theodicy of the sort that we can supply, which is not leaning on one of these schools of thought, but really deriving from all of them. So, for example, in the sort of the most important of all of them, does anybody happen to know what the most important theodicy is? Just call it out. Well, you're all muted though. Well, I'll just tell you what it is because you're all muted. It really comes from St. Augustine, should be Augustine. They call him Augustine. I don't like that, but anyway, St. Augustine. And he is a world-class religious genius beyond belief, really. You may disagree with him, but it's just incredible to read through his work. And so he is really the beginning of the systematization of theodicy, although they didn't call it that back then. That term was not used until the 17th century, but it was a theodicy. And in his work, he was obsessed with the problem of evil. And any of you that have read his work, particularly, say, Confessions, he's a classic sort of Catholic type personality who is concerned about his sins, right? And I guess he was a bit of a sinner as a young man. And so, but he was deeply philosophical and highly trained in classical rhetoric. So he was really able to express his ideas incredibly well. And his conclusion was, well, most of you know, he was in a way the originator, or not the originator, but the kind of the systematizer of the idea of original sin. And original sin may sound preposterous, but once you get into the literature about this, you realize they got a point here, because these are people that really, living in the Roman world where there's oppression and slavery and warfare and terrifically, awful conditions of life, gross, poverty. And so they really had reason to think there was original sin, that it was sort of baked in the cake, so to speak, in the human character. And so I didn't, once I got into the literature, I began to be a little bit more sympathetic with the Catholic view. And it's really in a way symbolic, but, they were literal minded about it. But with the deeper view of this is that it was more of a symbol, I think. But for Augustine, it was a symbol and literal, kind of both at the same time. But it basically says, look, that God is good and God is all powerful and God is not at fault, for the evil that we see, because humankind fell of its own choice. So Adam and Eve made the choice to reject the divine will. And having done that, they passed this down to the parents of humankind, passed this down. So everybody inherited, almost biologically, this tendency to sin. Not just a tendency to sin, it was sin that you could not overcome through your own effort. You had to have grace, and it had to come in a certain way for it to be efficacious. So you really, in the end, had to go through the sacraments of the church to get past this condition, and you had to keep going back to get the sacraments. And this was the sacramental Christianity also was of origin, pretty much, not of origin, but systematized in a very important way and theologized by Saint Augustine. So they had you locked into that system. You got original sin, you're a sinner, you're inherently sinful, and if you don't go through the system of the church, you're going to perdition. However, there is a qualifier on that too, which is that even if you're a good person, you may still not make it. Right? So there was a big problem in the theology, because the view was that mankind is so terrible that everybody should go to hell. And in your dark thoughts, you might also think, well, everybody should go to hell. But this was the doctrine. Everybody should go to hell because we disobeyed. Starting with Adam and Eve. So God was loving enough to save some of us, right? So almost everybody's going to perdition, but a minority is saved. So this is a doctrine that evolved later to be consistent. It had to be the case that God already had this figured out from eternity. Why do we say that? Because by the doctrine, God is eternal. So if you're in eternity, you can see what's going to happen. You have exhaustive foreknowledge of everything that's going to happen. So it must have been ordained by God for all these things to happen to you. And so he moved toward, at the end of his life, to this idea that the free will that we were given was not really free. It was not really free. But it was all twisted and turned around, because first he was thinking it is free, then he's thinking, well, they're working out these paradoxes because he gave us freedom, and somehow we're good because we were created by God, but we're evil, and in the core it was full of contradictions and paradoxes, and they were unable to resolve it. And so they left it unresolved, more or less unresolved, until they could come up with some doctrine that in which it was all determined by God. It's known as predestination. So this was systematized later on by Luther and Calvin into a literal doctrine of everything is already predestined. I want to emphasize that because it brings forward the importance of the Urantia revelation, in that the only way out of this dilemma is what? The idea of evolutionary deity. That's the only way you can deal with the problem of evil and not have to come up with these really strange, paradoxical doctrines. You cannot have a rational understanding, really, without the idea that deity evolves outside of the central universe, right? So inside the central universe, there is perfection, and there's a almost determination, almost by fiat, that residents of Havona are perfect. But in the evolutionary world, we have the supreme, reigns supreme, right? So supremacy is the determination of these vicissitudes having to do with good and evil, and that evil really is evil. So this is another key concept for everybody to ruminate about, which is, in the old view, evil is not really evil. Evil is not ontologically real. It's an appearance. And God is good, and we are made good, but by our free will we fell. But it's across the board, all that's good is harnessed. I'm sorry, all that's evil is harvested for good. So it's called the greater goods argument. So the greater goods argument in Theodicy is that God, permits and even ordains these things which we call evil, but actually God had a plan from the beginning, from eternity, which is these evil things will appear, to be painful and suffering, but it's all going to work out, every bit of it, because God had a plan even down to the most minuscule event to make good. Whereas in the post-evolutional view of evil, really 20th century, 19th century, technically, once we had evolution, then we could understand that evil is evil, that it really could be, in a way harmful, so much so that there is no recovery. And this brings us to one more, and then I'll take your question, Finney, which is that the notion, and I think you talk about this in your book, Steve Finland, and your new book, that universal, that everyone will be saved, and that's a very happy ending. So if you were snuffed out in the Ukraine war, it's not over. You're going to the afterlife, and you're going to have salvation, redemption, healing, and you're going to ascend to paradise. And that's the optimistic view that came forward in a lot of Christian theology, and for understandable reasons. But one of my discoveries of a distinction is that the Urantia Book doesn't do that. It doesn't. Not everybody is to be. It will go all the way to paradise. Some will not choose to go. Right, and those who, imagine if you were, you can't force somebody to choose to go on, as we're told in the text. They don't put it that way, but it is the case that some minority of all survivors choose the second death, as the biblical term for that. They choose not to go on, and but there are a number of, and even contemporary theologians that do not believe that to be the case. They're universalists, that everyone will be saved, and that's their theodicy. You see, their theodicy is that everything is going to work out in the eschatology, as they call it, in the end time, in the end of things, of all things. Good prevails universally, but the Urantia Book doesn't exactly say that, because if it were the case that good prevails universally throughout, the grand universe, for every individual, then that would be coercive, and free will would actually not be free. Because free will means you have to allow people to not survive. And this, so I'll stop there. And Finney, if you still have your question, I'll take it.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. The understanding of theodicy requires a concept of the supreme. So if you look at Christian theology, it doesn't really start to emerge until Hegel, Bergson, and especially Teilhard de Chardin in the 20th century. So there have to have been some Christian thinkers earlier who contributed to a good theodicy beyond the dreadful teachings of Augustine, in my opinion. So who do you look to between Augustine and Teilhard, or between Augustine and Hegel?
There really isn't any evolutionist of any significance until Hegel's generation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but maybe somebody who talked about free will.
Well, they're all talking about free will, but they're not making a distinction in regard to anything like the supreme.
No, but still, you could get some helpful theodicy if you can articulate the importance of free will as one of the factors causing evil, allowing evil.
Well, everybody does. Everybody has to. Well, you do throw out throughout the entire Christian tradition. The discussion is about free will until really you get to the really literal-minded determinists, as we call them. They're the determinist theologians, which was very much moving at the end of his life. Augustine was moving there, but in the Reformation, Luther jumped back and picked up on Augustine,
Yeah,
and then literalized it. that Augustine still kept it in this kind of paradoxical space, but he, and especially Calvin and others in that period, said, no, we're not going to have these highly refined elite distinctions of the scholastics of the Middle Ages. We're going to throw all that out. We're going to go all the way back to the master Augustine. And if you really read Augustine right, it's all determined by God, and free will is not really free. But they wouldn't put it like that. So they have to deal with free will too. They all do, and everybody does, unless, and maybe in the future we're going to be talking about robots running the world, which seems likely. But aside from that, so free will is the center of the dilemma, in a common sense way. And so I don't know if there was another part to your question that I forget.
I was just wondering if you have any heroes in the story in Christian theology.
Yeah, I'm kind of there. To me, they're all heroes. They're all amazing. The greater minds. That as you run through, Aquinas is unbelievably interesting. Augustine's even a hero of mine. I also think the patristic, the Greek, so-called Greek fathers of the church are incredibly important and underestimated very much by the Western theologians, because they really got a mix of elements that really work well in the Eastern Orthodox view of sin and evil. It was never as gloomy as it got to be in the West, and they never had to work it out but by saying, well, maybe it's all just God's determination. They never became determinists.
No,
they always had this opening for free will. You know what I mean? And that, having done your research on divinization and theosis, spirituality. But in the West, they didn't really think in terms of that we're in partnership with deity. That was we weren't even the junior partners. We were hopeless sinners, so we couldn't really contribute unless we were rehabilitated through the sacraments and through grace. And even then, you're not really you're not even a junior partner. You're getting there. But the Eastern Orthodox did from the beginning think that we were victorious over evil and sin because of the resurrection in particular. Not just that, but Pentecost. So they had a stronger sense of grace already being present, and they didn't fall into this gloomy view of things.
they had an idea of repair, where we will be spiritually repaired. Origen and Gregory of Nyssa had that idea.
Yeah, indeed, Gregory of Nyssa. and and that I like to think of it in terms of it is a kind of a partnership where you're the junior partner, but you are a partner
Yeah.
in terms of your free will, and you're not going to always be sinning, and so if you have some purification, then you can illumine the mind, and then even go beyond that, and so in the theosis, so-called doctrine of theosis or divinization, there's a lot of hopefulness in that, in terms of how we deal with evil as Eastern Orthodox Christians. So that's an important consideration. Thank you for bringing that
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
But just one more item regarding evolution, as you asked. For me, the heroic thinker in the 19th century is Hegel, and Hegel, I think, has much more priority than any of the other ones, just more depth in that he had an evolutional view as well as everything else, and with a Trinitarian doctrine. But when you get to Whitehead, to me, Whitehead is a more important figure than Teilhard de Chardin. It's a lot more depth, I think, in my view. Whitehead is coming forward with an idea of evolutionary deity. At the same time, the Urantia book is coming through in the 20s and 30s. So, he is coordinate sort of with the Urantia revelation on this idea of a supreme evolutional deity. And his Theodicy is really, really helpful. But what they did is dispense with the eternal God, more or less, and left you with an evolutional God. But they really have the same upshot as the Urantia book does in terms of the supreme in relation to evil. That the way I put it, the way I prefer to put it, is that in this view, evil really is it's not like this fake battle, right? Because for the traditional Christian, you're fighting a battle against evil, but it's guaranteed it's going to work out. That's the more deterministic view. But the more evolutionary view is a lot of the onus is on humans. It may not easily work out. Maybe it won't work out. Maybe the planet will be destroyed. There isn't necessarily the case that we'll get out of this, but there'll be certain conservation measures that the Celestials will take if we blow up the planet. But there are other planets, and so if it fails on Urantia, that isn't the failure of God. It's just a local failure. So this distinction is really hard to put together for all of us, which is there's an evolutionary deity, and what is the relationship of evolutionary deity to eternal deity? It's all over the place in the UB, but it's not easy to kind of explain that. It took me months and months to write these 2 chapters where I try to explain that in my own book, and I'm not sure I got it right, but no one's ever really the Whiteheadians who had this evolutionary deity. There were Catholic Whiteheadians, right? There were Catholics, right? So they had to bring back in a eternal God, into their evolutionary view. So these Catholics tried to put these two things, a Trinitarian God who's in eternity with an evolutionary God, and it's arcane stuff. But it takes something like the Urantia book to put these two things together. That there's central universe, and then there's the grand, there's the evolving universe, and what is their relationship? It's a rough thing to hold together, because you need a 2,000-page book to do it.
Yeah. Barbara's had her hand up.
Sorry, Barbara.
Byron, am I correct that this was the subject of your master's degree thesis? Is that right?
Yeah, so my master's thesis.
Yeah, I wanted to point that out. And my question related to that is, how have people in the theological circles responded to your including the Urantia book? You've done a beautiful job of the Judeo-Christian thinking and experience, but how have they responded to it?
Well, it's just my committee so far.
Okay.
There's two people, but the publisher is a mainstream academic Christian publisher, and I was really kind of shocked that they accepted it. And
Okay.
you know, but what I guess I've found, and maybe Stephen Finland knows this, is that these days, you know, Christians are open to new ideas.
Hmm.
Yeah, they just are. They're searching, and this particular publisher didn't really bat an eye. You know, they said, "Well, you write pretty well, and you came through Union Theological Seminary, so we'll accept it." And so I expanded the Urantia section. After they accepted my book, I had another Urantia chapter. But I do something that some of you may not like in the book, because at the end of the book, you know, I kind of extol the Urantia book. I go through all these different systems from the beginning, from starting from Job, Augustine, people like Aquinas, medieval, then the Reformation, Luther, and then up in post-Enlightenment, and then finally Kant and Hegel, and then what we call the post-Kantian modernity and all that. I cover all that. And then, so I think I earned the right to then give them the Urantia book. So, you know, so it's not like you're just bringing the Urantia book, which what we tend to do, isn't it? We don't contextualize. It's almost like, oh no, you Christians, you're just so out of it. We don't need to jive with any youth people, because we have the great revelation. So we're not even going to study your stuff. You weren't even going to study your material. You know, it's what we've been doing, right, from way back. But I think it's important to be a little bit more humble about it. So that's why I went back to school late in life, learn what this stuff is, and you find out it's fabulous. It's fabulous. It's every Urantia book reader would love to, you know, spend $100,000 and have a debt like that in order to learn what these
Absolutely.
people do. And so I was hoping that Biden would erase all the student debt, but no. Anyway, you know, I think it's going to be tested, because the book will be coming out soon. And secondly, thanks to the fellowship, I just got a chunk of money to have a booth at the American Academy of Religion in Denver, which is 2 weeks. And so we're going to have a Urantia booth at this academic theological conference with a couple thousand professors, and they're going to turn the corner and see the Urantia book, you know, and it's going to be a shock for everybody. So my new book will be there, the cover of the book, and then the UB, and I've got a lot of people from Boulder coming to person the booth and introduce it to academics. So I think one of the first times anybody has done this at it's called the American Academy of Religion, the AAR. So the funding was sufficient to put up this thing and put some secondary works out for people. But it's going to be it's not like being in a New Age book fair, right? You know, it's going to be academic theologians. So, you know, it's time. I think the time is ripe and well past due to present this and just tough it out. But we gotta, you know, for our part, we gotta show them that we respect what they do. So I kind of late in the game here, I started a little entity, which is putting on the booth cooperation with both the foundation and the fellowship. And the entity is called the Urantia Book Academy. I just threw together this name. It's called the Urantia Book Academy. And it now has a little website, urantiabookacademy.org. And that's focused on academics and the Urantia book, because I'd like to start teaching and invite any of you who want to teach at an academic level, not popular, but more academically informed instruction. So that's beyond what the UUI is doing, which is teaching each other. I want to invite people outside of our circle to come into an academic discussion. So I'm announcing that at the AER.
Yeah.
So I think we've gone into some good points.
Sue's got her hand up.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Byron. I'm trying to remember at what point I raised my hand because you've covered so many interesting things since my hand went up. But as I'm listening to all of the progress, I have to first thank the angels of progress for opening the doors and changing the hearts and minds and allowing some of these truths to penetrate these new audiences. And I'm just so heartened to hear about your progress in the academic world. As you were talking, I was thinking about this age-old tension between evil and free will, and the question that I have always gotten from my own kids and young people, and not even just young people: if God is so great and so good, why does he allow evil? And it's the free will evil tension. The only way that I've ever understood or gotten some peace with that tension is with the word potential. God didn't create or doesn't even permit evil, but he permits potential evil. That's the price of free will, is that, there's this open-ended possibility. The evolutionary deity, there's some unknowns. And so if we want to have the freedom, we have to understand, I guess, that other people are going to maybe go haywire with that. I had never heard the word theodicy before your talk, so I looked it up, and I thought there was a very interesting definition that just popped up. It was the vindication of divine goodness and providence in view of the existence of evil. And I love that word vindication because it made me think conquering. The strength of good, even though these things coexist. It's everything that we know in the Urantia book, that good and light will ultimately prevail and be vindicated, but we sure have to slug through a lot of garbage to get to that vindication. So I've really appreciated this whole conversation. It's complicated. I don't have an easy answer for that question, but I get it all the time from almost everybody I know under the age of 30. If God is so great, why does he permit? And I could give you 10 examples of atrocities. So I just wondered if you have an answer that you ever give or usually give, or.
Well, some of the things I've already said, but there is another very important item to add now in light of what you just said, and it was very well said. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's the notion of soul making as one way to explain or vindicate God's scheme here, which is to apparently ordain or at least permit evil. Well, the reason we get, and this is in the Urantia book itself, along with everything we've talked about, is covered in the UB to some extent. But you remember the page 52 in the old edition is the inevitabilities, right? So the inevitabilities amount to what is known in this field as the soul-making theodicy. And that vindicates God, because God is putting all these stumbling blocks in our path in order to build character, for character formation, for soul evolution. And that's what you get on that page 52, and beautifully stated. I quoted almost all of it in my own book because it's just so well put. But there is some marvelous Christian thinkers who also have the soul-making view. But the soul-making view was not going to mature until really the 19th century, when people understood, where everybody became an evolutionist or a developmentalist, right? You have to have a developmental framework in order to really get this idea that, oh, we're here, we're evolving from childhood on and growing a soul. and the soul itself is the most valuable asset we have, and it comes from hard knocks, so to speak. So you might call it hard knock spirituality, because we all go through these vicissitudes. Not everybody goes through it firsthand, but you're going through it secondhand. You're seeing the evil around you on television or hearing about it. So you're traumatized even just hearing about it, let alone going through it. So is there some aspect of this suffering and trauma wherein it's an opening or a portal into developing a better person? Well, yes, we come up against frustration and we overcome it. And if we develop our will and our determination, we become a better person. So what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. That's one crude way to put it. And so we really, all of us, in this discussion, we need to add that as another of the types of theodicies. It can be a standalone theodicy, but it's a little bit of a dangerous standalone by itself, because it seems to say that, oh, suffering isn't that bad. You're gonna make a better soul. Your soul's gonna grow. Well, no, a lot of suffering is not going to do that. It's what technically they call it dysteleological. There's teleological, this is dysteleological suffering. It's suffering that does not have a good outcome in any conceivable way. And so if you are such a person, for example, you may get to the mansion worlds and you will say, it's just this thing is designed in such a way that I have had trauma that's unbearable even here on the mansion worlds, and I don't want to deal with it. And or if you're a perpetrator, you may also say that, if you're Hitler on the mansion worlds, somebody might give him a sermon and say, well, it's soul making. You were a terrible person, but now you're going to make you're going to have a character formation by being in our mansion world instruction, and we're going to make you and Hitler says, you know what? I don't want to spend the rest of eternity being confronted by the people that I destroyed, and having to repent and having to face up to my terrible character flaws. I'd like to just be snuffed out, So we can't just say that suffering leads to greater goods, right? But it very often does, and for people of faith, it basically always does, right? If your faith is strong, whatever happens makes you a better person, almost by definition. That's what faith is it not? Faith is saying, I'm going to still be positive in my thinking, despite, war and death and, pestilence and you name it. I'm still going to make it. So if you're making it, you're soul making, this is soul making. So it's a very important notion in this. And we didn't get to, I didn't want to be too systematic here. There were half a dozen types of theodicies. Anybody that wants to, I have a single sheet about that, and you can email me and I'll send you the kind of rundown of these types of theodicies. And I think my email was published there. So I think we've covered some good stuff, and we'll take one or two questions. Anybody else?
Yes, this has been great, especially to do it on the fly when you didn't even know you were doing this tonight. Even more impressive.
Yeah, 3 years of this full time, you get pretty good at it.
Linda has a question.
Byron, I liked your comment about soul making, and I've been looking at this very thing, and we all are obviously at this time, but I was looking at it from the standpoint of we're trying to stretch to know beyond our belief about what is spiritual, and what is eternally real is what is spiritual, but it's so far beyond our grasp. And so it seems to me that understanding, that if we gain an understanding that our process is a spiritual developmental process, like we understand physical and emotional and intellectual development, that would basically what you're saying is soul making. But as we, as we master use of mind, and as we identify with and become more spiritual in our thinking and our acting and so forth, then we will live in a way that we are more aligned with our thought adjusters and more develop further in the development, but that also we will not need this degree of evil and so forth. We will express less of that as we mature, because what that is the fact that we're material. Then we are therefore innately going to have the possibility of evil until we become so spiritualized that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Like the Urantia book says. But just one more comment. Shoot, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
Well, you made
But I guess I'm thinking that we don't, sometimes I hear people suggesting that we need the degree of suffering that we have. And I think we don't. I think if we can behave and live in a more spiritual way, that just that possibility, a smaller degree of it, and just the possibility is sufficient for us to make the choices to soul develop.
Right. On normal planets, it's far less degree. Far less, right? Far less. So looks like they're growing, looks like they're doing okay. Looks like they're getting to light and life and generating universe citizens. We don't need this much. No, we don't. No, we're one. I did a calculation. I think it was 0.006% of all planets have a rebellion. Right. So what about all the rest of them? So they don't have this degree of iniquity, right? Iniquities might not even be a term they know much about. So yeah, we have a surplus way over the top. And being Americans, we have less so, than our friend from Africa who's with us, maybe, hopefully not. And in a way, Africans are happier than we are. But so we really have to be able to help our fellows understand. I think this is really a closing point to make, is to help them understand as the sort of the collapse of this world system continues, that what is going on here is really, in a way, the upshot of the Luciferic governance, the Caligastia's governance of the planet. And that's inconceivably worse than a normal planet. So how do you get that across to people? Do you mail them a 2,000-page book? Is that how you get across? No, we have to be able to explain this in common language, what we're up against in an unusual experimental planet that had a rebellion, where the angels themselves went over to the dark side. How do we explain that? Well, the Bible has an explanation, particularly in the book of Revelation, that you get some sense of that. But it's still, people don't understand why we had the crucifixion, the resurrection, we had the Pentecost. Why is this delayed? Why are we having genocides, and why are we having such inequality and corruption? Why is that? And we have to find language. And I would submit that we need to be able to use Christian language and Christian terms, which the Urantia book does too, by the way, and show our mastery of this problem, and minister to others in terms of this framework that we're talking about today. And really the ultimate point I would make is, and you can tell folks that more or less everything Christianity says about this problem is covered in the Urantia book and synthesized and brought forward and for the future. And that's for constellation and for compensation to all of us through Revelation. So I'm going to leave you with that and take my leave. Get back to my friend who's been patient and visiting with, and thank you all for. And you can send me a note if you like.
Well, I want to thank you, Byron. And before you go, I have one last question. When and where can we expect to be able to find your new book?
It'll be in the spring, and it would just be on Amazon, and it's maybe March or April. And but I'm a publicist for my own stuff.